If you did not see somebody to sign in on the way up the stairs, please make sure before you leave that somebody gets your name, preferably with a computer, writes it down so that we know who you are, and we have your email address so that you can come back and see us again. But some people miss, so enjoy.
Great. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the David Berg Foundation Lectures, Rabbi Ethan Tucker's signature series on core issues of Jewish law. This is the first part of a three-part series. Our next two sessions will be holding next Thursday the 11th and the following Thursday the 18th. I'd like to publicly acknowledge and thank the David Berg Foundation for making these lectures possible. For those of you who don't know, Rabbi Ethan Tucker is one of our Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Hadar, as well as our chair in Jewish law. And the format of tonight's lecture is going to be a lecture. So just so you know, we're handing around an outline of the lecture so folks can follow. And also, the lecture will be available on Ustream in video form on our website, as well as a podcast on our website tomorrow. After the lecture, there'll be time for questions. So if you can hold your questions, that would be great. And that's it. So now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Rabbi Ethan Tucker.
Kifela harimon rakatech. Your temple is like a section of pomegranate, says in the Song of Songs. But about this said Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Al tikrei rakatech ela rekatech, she'afilu rekanin shebach mele'in mitzvot karimon. Don't read rakatech, your temple, but rekatech, your emptiness, because even the emptiest among you are full of mitzvot like a pomegranate is full of seeds. Now, two critical points emerge from the allegorization of this verse in Shir HaShirim. First is the remarkable fact proffered here that all Jews, even those who appear to the rabbinic elite as empty and worthless, are in fact practicing and committed. Even the least sophisticated Jew, says Reish Lakish, is overflowing with Jewish practice and thus commands God's praise in this love song between an eternal people and their loving God. Jews do mitzvot, says Reish Lakish. They don't always do so with enthusiasm, with understanding, with the correct intention, but they live in a culture of mitzvot that even the most critical eye ought to be able to recognize. But even more remarkable than this fact of practice and commitment is Reish Lakish's ability to see it. Reish Lakish projects a sense of confidence in the average Jew. Even when such a person is falling short of rabbinic ideals, they are still real and meaningful contributors to the matrix of committed Jewish life. And this, after he begins by describing them as empty and worthless. He recognizes the ways in which even the apparently empty Jew forms the backbone of the Jewish community and fills out a picture of practice that no elite can ever totally bear on its own. In short, I would suggest to you that this statement of Reish Lakish overflows with trust and respect. Trust of the people by rabbis and respect of the people for their tradition. Could anything be farther from our contemporary reality and from the current state of discourse and practice of halakha? We live in a world in which most rabbinic participants in halakhic conversation view most of the Jewish world, rightly, to be hostile to their project. We live in a Jewish world that is commonly bifurcated into the observant and the non-observant, the halakhic and the non-halakhic, a world in which perhaps the greatest spiritual deficits that we face are those of trust and respect. Most rabbis engaged with halakha don't trust the average contemporary Jew, seeing emptiness and worthlessness, laziness, and a lack of commitment that inspire fear rather than praise. And most contemporary Jews don't really respect the tradition they have inherited, and whether for reasons of ignorance or ideology, can hardly be said to be as full of mitzvot as a pomegranate is of seeds. Now, how did we take leave of the world of Reish Lakish and end up in our present moment? And is there any way for us to get back to that world of trust and respect? Tonight I want to explore that question together as we strive to understand the genesis of our present moment and begin to chart a way forward. The 21st century is hardly the first time that Jews have abandoned Jewish practice, nor is it the inaugural epicenter of rabbinic mistrust of the wayward. Our earliest memories preserve a picture of normative expectations imperfectly fulfilled, and a deep struggle on the part of leaders as to how to respond to that imperfection. As in all things related to leadership, Moshe Rabbeinu serves as the first paradigm of this dynamic, and it comes in this week's Torah reading. The ultimate breach of the covenant, the golden calf, that moment where right as the people seem to be immersed in the depths of the revelatory power of God, they abandon their relationship with God and turn to idolatry. And we find Moshe having a remarkable split reaction to that moment of Jewish waywardness. On the one hand, Moshe, when speaking with God, pleads for perspective. See the bigger picture. Lama Hashem yachareabcha be'amecha. Why? Please don't be angry with them. They're after all your people, descendants of your beloved patriarchs. And then just a few verses later, Moshe is entirely uncompromising and says, Mi Lashem Elai, Simu ish charbo al yirecho ivru vashuvu misha'ar lasha'ar b'machaneh v'hirgu ish et achi v'ish et re'ehu v'ish et krovo. Instead of defending the wayward people, he attacks them, calling on others to help him kill them. After he sees this complete collapse of the people's exclusive relationship with God, he loses it and decides nothing but separation from and annihilation of the sinners will suffice. It is time for those who stand with God to stand apart, even from those who are their brothers, relatives, and friends. And that, I would submit to you, has been the challenge of Jewish leadership in many generations. When to take a broad view and to engage all of the people, even those who seem to be deviating from tradition, and when to batten down the hatches and ride out a storm whose raw power cannot possibly be resisted. When do you adopt a broader perspective of inclusion and tolerance, and when do you purge the dead weight? Modernity's challenge to European Jews, however, was particularly stark, even with all of the similar history prior to it. Throughout the Middle Ages, rabbinic authorities and Jewish communities were responsible for all Jews, with the exception of those who actively converted out or those who actively took steps to separate themselves from the community. Even Jews who might not have bought fully into rabbinic halacha were nonetheless under the purview of the political structure in which rabbis played a critical role. And as a result, halacha was bound to the entire Jewish community and responsible to it. Emancipation allowed Jews, for the first time since the crystallization of rabbinic authority in the Middle Ages, to leave the Jewish community without any serious consequences. And instead of being consigned to membership in the vassal rabbinic states that were embedded within their European hosts, Jews were now invited to be citizens of the general society. Jewish political authority largely disappeared. Though Jewish communities still administered funds distributed by the states to the various religious communities, but Jews in Europe steadily acculturated and assimilated, adopting patterns of living much more similar to their Gentile neighbors than to those of their ancestors. And rabbis and Jewish communities lost control over Jews and thus lost responsibility for them as well. That dynamic would very quickly present rabbis with a fateful choice. To what extent would they continue to live out the medieval model, imagining themselves to lead the entire population of Jews, despite the fact that the gulf between rabbinic expectations and common practice continued to widen? Or would they instead retreat into a smaller slice of the Jewish community, those who actively and publicly elected to sign on to the rabbinic project in their daily lives, speaking only to the audience that seemed keen to hear what they had to say? One day stands out as the historical focal point of this process, July 28th, 1876. Probably not many of you have heard of that date before. But it was on that date that the Prussian government passed what was known as the Austritt Gesetz, the law permitting elements of a religious community to secede and form their own subcommunity and receive their share of government funding for religious institutions. This law was the moment of truth for those German Jews who wanted to resist the forces of religious reform. Would they work within the larger Jewish community to advance their own agenda, even as Jewish institutions were increasingly controlled by advocates of reform? Or would they secede and form their own Orthodox community, essentially separating politically and communally from their co-religionists? Now, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who had advocated fiercely for the Austritt-Gesetz, jumped at the chance to secede and formed his own Orthodox Jewish community. Not only did Hirsch want the right to secede, he saw it as an obligation. Effectively the first to espouse the idea that there is a mitzvah to be Orthodox, he declared that the religious reformers were heretics who were destroying the fundamentals of Torah, and it was an obligation to do whatever one could to remove oneself from this sort of religiously compromised community and its authority. As Hirsch saw it, anyone who would try to perpetuate the medieval model in the face of the post-emancipation collapse of traditional Jewish practice was a fool at best and a traitor at worst. But even as Hirsch charged into secession, there were others who resisted him, both in his own community and beyond. Rav Yitzhak Dov Bamberger of Würzburg emerged as his fiercest critic, asserting in a series of public letters that there was absolutely no obligation to secede as long as the Jewish communal organizations were willing to facilitate traditional religious observance for those who chose it, as was indeed the case in Hirsch's community. Bamberger also attributed importance to having a presence of Torah and mitzvot in a Jewish community that might be influenced in a more traditional direction. Does the discourse of halacha and the community it is attached to need to stay in dialogue with those who are potentially leaving it? Hirsch answered no. Bamberger answered yes. Now, ultimately, the European communities that grappled with these difficult issues in Germany and elsewhere were washed away by the flood of the Shoah. But the core questions remain with us today. Indeed, Hirsch, in his time, launched the model of a truly secessionist, independent orthodoxy that remains with us as the dominant form of orthodoxy until today. While America's strict separation of church and state makes religion a highly voluntaristic affair, Hirsch's notion that orthodoxy must look out for orthodoxy, and that its halacha must look out for Orthodox Jews, and largely ignore those outside of that political grouping, deeply defines the contours of halachic discourse in the United States up until the present. Even in Israel, where there is a Jewish government responsible for all Jewish citizens, and where religion and state remain intertwined, the dynamics of secessionist halacha remain very strong and preserve a discourse where halacha looks out for the needs and assumptions of religious Jews, who are presumed to be halacha's only relevant audience. This leads to crises on issues of marriage, divorce, and burial, to name just a few, where the entire population is subject to decisions formulated from a religious stance that is foreign and alien to it. Now, the raison d'etre of a secessionist halacha is fairly obvious. It hopes to preserve religious commitment and integrity in the face of overwhelming apathy and antipathy. How can halacha possibly engage with those who don't care about it or who scorn it? And if it did engage with those people, wouldn't it be hopelessly compromised, always shifting in the wind in order to make fair weather fans and destroying itself and its integrity in the process? Hirsch confronted a community that he felt was out to destroy the core principles that grounded his Jewish life. Wasn't that the moment to stand up and say, Mi Lashem Elai, whoever is for God, come to me? Now, for all I know, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's response was right and necessary for his time. Perhaps the secessionist halacha was, in fact, the only way to ride out the storm of modernity as it hit with full force. Could be that Rav Yitzhak Dov Bamberger was rearranging deck chairs as the Titanic was going down. We're all certainly sensitive to the notion that at times, building coalitions with the opposition turns out to be a Trojan horse for appeasement. But a charitable agnosticism regarding past decisions does not excuse us from reevaluating their continued application in a later time and place. And we must do so with respect to the model of secessionist halakha. And a close examination reveals that secessionist halakha has serious drawbacks as well. Drawbacks that today outweigh any of its benefits. First, in its quest for survival, secessionist halakha becomes distorted. Because it only engages with the self-selected community of the halachically faithful, it narrows its field of vision and highly limits the scope of issues it will deal with. Isn't it amazing, given all of the endless numbers of tshuvot written by contemporary poskim, masters in all of the areas of rabbinic literature, how an effectively infinitesimal number of them address issues of gender and tefillah, homosexuality, other issues that are religiously consuming for huge numbers of the Jewish people. The radio silence on those issues is deafening and reveals the ways in which halakha has largely been blindfolded and has one, if not two hands tied behind its back, as it is largely shielded from serious engagement with the most difficult issues of the day. You can see a glimpse of this dynamic in a fascinating tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein from 1958, which you have on the sheets in front of you, which is a snapshot of the fading interaction of halakha with the full data of people's lives and their concerns. As I read it, listen to how Rav Moshe answers the question posed to him, but can't quite believe that he has to. You can feel the process of alienation between posek and community unfolding before your eyes. Question: is there a prohibition to tell a Gentile to remove makeup from one's face on Shabbat? With regard to the strange question about a theater actor who thinks of his work as for the sake of heaven, on the theory that if he excels at acting, he will be able to more effectively guide young Jews to be more observant. This seems highly implausible, since most plays are foolish and trivial matters, full of sex and mocking the seriousness of murder. And even though there is occasionally a play where there is no foolishness or foul language or mocking of murder and sex, I think I saw one of those once, this is unusual, and it is nearly impossible for one who makes a profession out of it to avoid these issues. But certainly, you must draw this man close, because he won't listen to you to avoid this profession entirely, since he feels differently. And you must draw him close according to his own way, so that he will minimally keep the essentials of Torah and faith in God and God's Torah, given that we see that this man is careful about observing Shabbat according to halakha. And now, with regard to your questions, if it is permitted to ask a Gentile to remove makeup on Shabbat by applying cold cream, if there's a need to do so, one can be lenient. Now, Rav Moshe describes this question as Hashe'elah hamuzara, the strange question. The stranger the question seems, the fewer people will ask it. And the less people ask it, the less poskim will think they need to engage with questions like this. And so on, until hair-splitting questions on issues of paramount concern to only a few people come to overwhelm halachic discourse. A second problem with secessionist halakha is that in its quest for survival, it abandons its covenantal relationship with most Jews. By writing off most Jews as irrelevant to the conversation, poskim stop looking for ways to understand their behavior and simply move to a stance of despair. It is a short step from there to giving up altogether on the Torah's mission to all Jews and the broader covenant of mitzvot, and its claim on the entire Jewish people is thus compromised. One brief example illustrates well how the same data can produce very different responses, depending on how a posek understands his relationship with the larger Jewish community. The Mishnah establishes unambiguously that women and men have an identical obligation in the Amidah, the fixed daily prayer. And there is no hint anywhere in Talmudic literature that women and men should pray the Amidah any differently from one another. And yet, throughout history, there have been many communities in which women and men did pray differently in seeming contravention of rabbinic rules. In 13th century Spain, Rav Yonah Gerondi reports a deviation with respect to the language of prayer. The Talmud seems to conclude that whereas the public Amidah can be done in other languages, the private Amidah must be done in Hebrew. And you have the source from Rabbeinu Yonah on the sheet in front of you. Since we have concluded that private tefillah can only be said in Hebrew, I'm deeply puzzled by the universal custom of women to pray in other languages, since by virtue of their obligation in prayer, they should have to pray in Hebrew like everyone else. The rabbis of France try to justify this practice by saying that when an individual prays the same tefillah that is recited in public, that private prayer is considered public, and one can say it in another language. And that which Rabbi Yehuda said in the Talmud, one should never ask for one's needs in Aramaic, applies when one asks for one's private needs, such as praying for a sick person or regarding any problem in one's home. But tefillah, the Amidah, which is known by the entire community, even when one prays it in one's own home, it is as if it is being prayed in public. And if one does not know Hebrew, one may fulfill one's obligation in any language. What happens in this passage is not a small thing. The French rabbis quoted here confront a deviant practice, and instead of rushing to condemn it, they search for another reading of the Talmudic sugya in question in order to justify these women. The bond linking the posek and the community is very strong here. So strong that a deviant practice is presumed to contain some heretofore undiscovered insight into the canonical legal text. This sort of trusting dynamic is even more boldly on display in an early modern Polish text, this time Rav Avraham Gombiner's commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Magen Avraham. Here the Magen Avraham is confronting an even more dramatic breach. Women are not praying the Amidah at all. No Talmudic passage or medieval commentary ever suggested that the obligation in the Amidah was gendered in any way, as evidenced by the passage of Rabbeinu Yonah that we just read, who does not rush to justify that practice by suggesting in some way, well, it's women, they don't have to follow the same rules. We would expect the Magen Avraham to condemn these non-praying women. But instead we get this as a comment on the Shulchan Aruch's daily description of daily prayer as a positive commandment. The Magen Avraham says, a positive commandment. So wrote the Rambam, who thinks that tefillah is a positive biblical commandment, as it is written, and to serve God with all your heart. But biblically, it's sufficient for the Rambam to recite one prayer a day in any formulation that one wishes. Therefore, most women have the practice of not praying regularly, because immediately after washing their hands in the morning, they say some request, and this is biblically sufficient, and it is possible that the sages did not extend their obligation any further. But the Ramban thinks that tefillah is rabbinic, and this is the opinion of most disciples. The legal details of this Magen Avraham are beyond the scope of our discussion tonight. But suffice it to say that the Magen Avraham effectively invents in this passage an entire new model of tefillah that never existed before, borrowing a conceptual model present in the Rambam in order to create an unprecedented notion that the obligation in the Amidah might be gendered, all in order to avoid suggesting that the women in question are deviant. For the record, the Magen Avraham backs off this suggestion at the end of this passage and elsewhere, and he searches for other types of justification for women's failure to pray. But what should interest us here is the halachic relationship at work. Here is a posek who deeply trusts his community, and who therefore views their practice as a text, in light of which other written canonical texts must be re-examined. This dynamic is very difficult to find in our own day, and just a few centuries later, on this same topic, we see a significant shift as Rav Yisrael Meir HaKohen addresses this in his Mishnah Berurah. Here we find a more familiar halachic dynamic, a failure of faith in the community and an exhortation to change their practice. The Mishnah Berurah, because it is a positive commandment, this is all according to the Rambam's opinion that only the times of tefillah are rabbinic, but that the essence of the commandment of tefillah is biblical. And the Magen Avraham wrote that based on this reasoning, most women do not have the practice to pray the Amidah regularly. But Ramban's opinion is that the essence of the commandment of tefillah is from the sages, And even though tefillah is a positive time-bound commandment and women are exempt from all such commandments, the sages obligated them in shacharit and mincha just like men, since tefillah is a request for mercy. And this opinion is correct, for this is the opinion of most authorities. Therefore, women should be instructed to pray the Amidah. Now again, the precise contours of the legal argument here need not concern us. What is noteworthy is how the relationship between posek and community has changed. The Mishnah Berurah assumes that a deviant practice is a deviant practice and needs to be corrected. Gone is the faith in the community's commitment and religious insight. The received wisdom of the text is fixed. Jews either will or will not orbit around it. This is the dynamic of a secessionist halacha, one that is no longer really in dialogue with the diversity of practice in the community, but rather judges the worthiness of the community based on how much it is in line with assumed unidimensional halachic norms. Any student of the Mishnah Berurah is familiar with its repetitive usage of Uva'avonotenu harabim and V'ha'olam nichshalim bazeh, V'ha'olam ein nizharim bazeh, and V'yesh lahazhir, V'yesh limchot, phrases that all underscore the gap between some idealized fixed halacha and a community that fails and refuses to live up to it. Those words and phrases are strikingly rare or completely absent in the Magen Avraham. It's a small step from this posture of lack of trust and alienation to writing off the plausibility of engaging these sections of the Jewish community altogether. And once that final step is taken, God's covenant of mitzvot with the entire Jewish people has been decimated. Finally, the last weakness of secessionist halacha, which is essentially a cousin of the previous weakness, is the way in which secular Jews buy their freedom from the halachic conversation at the price of losing any input over its content. On a surface level, Jews who describe themselves as secular, non-halachic, or non-observant love secessionist halacha, which claims only to look out for halachic Jews and largely leaves them alone. Hirsch was not interested in making reforming German Jews be Orthodox. He just wanted to preserve the possibility of being Orthodox. Much like the voices in antebellum America who advocated letting the South go her sinful way and continuing on with a smaller, pure republic, so too Orthodox secessionists are generally uninterested in bringing secular Jews back to Jewish practice. And secular Jews are, for this reason, often fans of the dynamics of Austritt, which offers them the benefit of being left alone. Indeed, many Jews would fight tooth and nail any sort of halachic regime that made a claim on them as imperialist and coercive. In reality, however, it works out the other way. It does not work out the way you might think. Jews end up confronting the legacy of halachic choices and dynamics one way or another, whether it be through the state of Israel, through relatives, through the people their children fall in love with, and they thus end up returning to the table of halachic conversation in one way or another. Secessionist halacha conspires to leave them out of that conversation and deprives them of any internal voice in shaping it. Which more deeply respects autonomy? You tell me. To exempt someone from taxes or to grant them representation in Congress? Is it really more respecting of a given Jew's religious choices to grant them freedom while writing them out of the halachic language of the covenant? Or is it actually more respectful to articulate expectations and obligations of all Jews and therefore assume that their questions and concerns must shape the issues that poskim grapple with? Paradoxically, making a more imperialistic claim of the obligatory scope of halacha makes it potentially more responsive and gives it a broader constituency. This often plays out dramatically in terms of communal food practices in Jewish communities. In most American communities, no one trusts anyone else's kashrut because everyone's right to make their own religious choices with respect to food is held to be sacrosanct. As a result, I cannot assume anything about what my neighbor may or may not eat in her house. And therefore, if I want to eat food prepared by others, My choices are either to throw my hands up in compromise, allowing for laxity in the name of community, or I can choose only to eat in the homes of some members of my community, or I can insist that all meals be catered. This goes on all the time. All of these solutions share in common a basic mistrust that flows from an unwillingness to articulate expectations that apply to the entire community. By contrast, one of the most striking things that I encountered while living on a religious kibbutz in Israel was the way in which everyone brought food to communal gatherings without any questions ever being asked. Why? Because there was a clearly articulated expectation that everyone was shomer kashrut. And once that value was articulated and that assumption was made, the doors of community and trust were thrown wide open and everyone was included. Similarly, people often ask, why are full-time fellows at Yeshivat Hadar expected to be shomrei mitzvot? Why can't this just be a pluralistic community that respects ambivalent and even antagonistic responses to Jewish observance? Aside from the yeshiva's commitment to mitzvot as a fulfillment of the covenant, and our conviction that Torah and mitzvot are a deeply compelling way of life that we want to model and strengthen, there's an important communal reason as well. Only by making that assertion an expectation of all in the community can we then create a community that can move away from dynamics of mistrust and towards a sense of unified purpose. Austritt militates against this and buys freedom for secular and non-observant Jews on the cheap with a very high deferred cost. For all these reasons, the cost of a secessionist halacha are high, and the benefits, I argue to you, are no longer warranted. The fact is this: Jewish religious practice survived the trauma of modernity. At the end of the day, emancipation drastically reduced the number of Jews who self-understand as religiously observant. But a sizable number have freely chosen religious practice without any external coercion. And therefore, the argument for secession in the name of preserving the world of mitzvot is no longer nearly as compelling as it might once have been. Moreover, Jews who wanted to leave religious practice have done so. The emancipation is complete. The relevant conversation today is not about keeping Jews in the fold of observance. It's rather about engaging all Jews in a meaningful halachic conversation and giving them language of meaning and purpose that so many desperately crave. And modern Jews, for whom the facts of the modern world are not conscious choices, but the given details of their lives, will by and large simply never enter a conversation that demands of them to secede from themselves. As noted above, there's a deeply ironic twist to Hirsch's vision of secessionist halacha. The strategy of preserving halacha by cordoning it off from corruption by most of the Jewish people has led over time to a narrowing distortion of what halacha could mean and could say about the pressing issues facing the Jewish people today. I think it is fair to say that some of the lack of creativity in halachic discourse today is a continuation of the Austritt dynamic. In a way, the fear of engaging the broader community is a fear that the tradition cannot survive in the marketplace of ideas. And for anyone who takes seriously the Torah's claim that an outsider looking at a life of mitzvot would naturally and spontaneously exclaim, Umi goy gadol, asher lo chukim umishpatim tzadikim kechol haTorah hazot. What an amazing way that is to live, which is how the Torah self-describes. That is a dynamic that has got to stop. For all these reasons and others, the current state of halacha is in trouble. The discourse of halacha has become unmoored from the people it's trying to guide, and most Jews are not sufficiently committed to make a claim on halacha and to expect that it ought to respond to their reality. Or to put both of these points together in a single thought, halacha and the Jewish people have become deeply mutually alienated one from the other. We must move away from the secessionist halacha that has reinforced these dynamics and find a way to return to the world of Reish Lakish, in which mitzvot are ubiquitous, and those engaged with the language of halacha can see that reality and take it seriously. So how do we do that? I want to suggest 6 steps tonight for making that a reality. 3 devoted to ways in which we reimagine the halachic enterprise, and 3 devoted to ways in which we reimagine our expectations of the Jewish community. Let's begin with the ways in which our halachic discourse must change. First, halakha must be real, not just ideal. For too long now, in an effort to preserve an idealized vision of the past, and in the name of riding out the storm of modernity, halachic sources have been used to construct an abstract ideal space of practice and commitment into which the messy details of the real world must be shoehorned. Too many contemporary thinkers advocate applying halachic strictures to the world from behind a veil of ignorance, rather than see the world and life as a mere shadow of the idyllic space of Torah. We must return Torah to its rightful place as the guide for navigating the lives we actually lead. Halachic sources should respond directly to our challenges and our realities, pushing us to advance the cause of Torah within that world. Teachers and preachers of halakha must abandon the world of forms and speak to the world as it is. Now this, for careful students of rabbinic literature, is nothing more and nothing less than hachzarat atara liyoshna, simply returning the conversation to what Torah always was for Chazal and for their intellectual and spiritual descendants. One need only read a few Mishnayot into the beginning of the Mishnah to encounter laws that articulate the way ideally something should be done and the way in which, in the imperfect world in which it is likely to be done, it is tolerable to accept as valid. The categories of ideal, lechatchila, on the one hand, and real, b'diavad, on the other. A rabbinic Jew going through the material of Chazal inhabits a religious world that emphasizes rigorous ab initio requirements, even as it acknowledges the complexity of certain post facto circumstances. That, I would suggest to you in a nutshell, is the greatest legal contribution of the rabbis to Jewish legal discourse. Other Second Temple groups were certainly concerned with Jewish legal norms and behavior, but only rabbinic literature features a sustained attempt to merge a vision of the ideal with an understanding of the real. Rather than allowing religious personalities to flounder in the face of a world not entirely of their making, Chazal's approach gives structure and meaning to all circumstances in a person's life, specifying when minimal standards have been met and when further diligence is required. Numerous sources display such tendencies. I want to have you consider one from Mishnah D'mai. Consider the following text also on the sheets in front of you. If one receives a Shabbat invitation from someone who is untrustworthy with respect to tithes, one can say the following before Shabbat. That which I will separate out tomorrow is ma'aser, and the rest of the required amount of ma'aser will be right next to it. The part that I will have separated out will be trumat ma'aser, and the ma'aser sheni will be located either in the northern or southern end of the food, and is redeemed with currency I have set aside for that purpose. Try saying that 3 times fast. The scene here involves a dilemma. It's forbidden to designate tithes on Shabbat, and yet one anticipates being in a situation on Shabbat when one will be served potentially untithed produce. The Mishnah comes up with a way to designate the tithes in advance, leaving only the physical separation to be done on Shabbat, and thus resolving the legal dilemma. But think about what this text does not say, but could have. Why are you friends with someone who is untrustworthy about tithing? Why are you accepting a Shabbat invitation to his house? Why don't you say, Jewish law forbids me to eat with you on Shabbat? This Mishnah, and rabbinic sources in general, don't say things like that. Why? Because they don't evade difficult situations, and they don't deny the real and complex social interactions that often drive our normative deliberations. Encoded in this text in D'mai is respect for the fact that friendship and social ties transcend communities of observance. It's not the Mishnah's job to rebel against that reality. It's the Mishnah's job to to provide guidance to the God-fearing about how to respond to it. And so too, our halacha must return to this posture, allowing the Torah to speak forcefully and nimbly to our lives. Step 2 is learning to respect religious instincts. Many years ago, one of my wife's friends related to us how she once had lied on Shabbat and felt horrible about it. I, with the smug wisdom of a young 20-something, mocked this story. Here was a woman who did not observe Shabbat in any rabbinically conventional way, suggesting that lying, not a melacha, last I checked, was somehow more problematic on Shabbat than during the rest of the week, and worthy of an extra measure of guilt when done on the seventh day. I chalked this story up as yet another instance of the contemptible ignorance of so many contemporary Jews. I soon ate my words. I was learning Mishnah Dmai 4:1. Oh, you're going to go home and learn this Masechet, which talks about how one who properly tithes his produce can interact with one who does not. Specifically, the Mishnah addresses the question of when a generally untrustworthy person might be trustworthy with respect to tithes. And it says the following: one who purchases produce from an untrustworthy tither and then forgot to tithe the produce himself may ask the person on Shabbat if it has been tithed and rely on his word to eat it. And in the Talmud Yerushalmi, Rabbi Bevai explains the basis for this Mishnah in the name of Rabbi Hanina. The fear of Shabbat is upon this generally untrustworthy person, and he tells the truth. Not only had I violated the ban on ever having contempt for another human being, but my wife's friend's practice was hardly her own fanciful invention. Here was guilt with a 2,000-year-old pedigree. And from that day forward, I promised myself to take seriously the religious assumptions and instincts of any sincere person. Why? For starters, they're often grounded in something real, a kernel of wisdom that might at first be overlooked, but upon second inspection, unlock a deeper truth heretofore unrevealed. There is actually something deep about not lying on Shabbat as part of a quest to create a more perfect space and time, one in which deception takes a break for a day, along with all the other tolls of the week. To ignore those gems of wisdom and insight is to be religiously and halachically impoverished. But even more essentially, if we hope to recapture a world in which all Jews are full of mitzvot, we must begin in part by seeking out the halachic instincts of average Jews. Those instincts must be engaged, probed, and often challenged, but also used as fulcrums with which to leverage a deeper investigation of halachic discourse. Im einam nevi'im b'nei nevi'im hem. All Jews are the disciples of prophets. Their religious insights are thus ipso facto commanding of our attention in this way. The third thing we need to change about our halacha is avoiding sectarianism. A healthy halacha that seeks a broad base of support will cultivate an allergy to legal formulations that leave too many people comprehensively shut out of the conversation. Religious leaders surely must work to inspire deeper commitment and to change behaviors. But there is a wide gap between increasing and intensifying observance and constructing a halacha that could only ever plausibly be followed by a tiny minority of the Jewish people. In an article written in 2008, Tzvi Zohar documents a few examples of what he calls teleological psak, where the legal authority in question consciously pursues a specific analysis in the aim of a certain halachic end. And Zohar cites one example where the posek argues that he must decree that it is only rabbinically forbidden to transport items on Shabbat through the main thoroughfares of Mumbai, as opposed to biblically forbidden, since otherwise the masses of Jews who routinely carry parasols and snuff with them on Shabbat, yes, snuff, would be violating biblical law. Now, this is a particularly extreme example of bending the interpretation of the law to common practice, and it's often difficult and perhaps unwise to accomplish. But the overarching goal in this text is of enduring value. No halacha should be glibly satisfied with drawing lines that will write most of the community completely out of its purview. One of the major tasks of contemporary poskim is to think through the ways in which the halachot that they advocate for could integrate into the lives of a contemporary Jew who lives a modern life integrated into the larger society. In an increasingly gender egalitarian society, any halacha that does not have something meaningful to say about gendered halachot in our time, other than to affirm old forms and apologetic language, is consigning itself to short-term sectarian existence and long-term religious irrelevance. For those of us who care deeply about Torah and its influence on the world, that sort of model is unacceptable. We must always ask of ourselves and of the halakha we teach, can I say about this, Morasha Kihilat Yaakov? Could the Jewish community of today truly own this halakha and practice it with a straight face? The student and teacher of halakha should never rest until the answer to that question is yes. But we began not only with Reish Lakish's ability to see mitzvot and religious commitment elsewhere, we also began with the actual presence of that commitment in the Jewish community. And this is the tougher part to hear, but it is critical to restoring halachic health. Even if practitioners of halakha reorient themselves along the lines we have suggested tonight, the contemporary Jewish community must do three things. The first relates to questions of tone, the second relates to curriculum, and the third relates to basic self-respect and integrity. First, we must stop in the Jewish community apologizing for normativity. The Jewish community, particularly in North America, has to come to terms with the fact that we are all free individuals who are at liberty to lead whatever kind of life we want. The emancipation is complete. There is no real obstacle to the fullest expressions of individual autonomy. And against that backdrop, it should always be assumed that anyone has the right, and more importantly, the power, to disagree with any rabbinic or communal pronouncement on any topic without any real consequences other than those that are self-imposed. And therefore, given that there is no vestige of medieval coercive power, at least in the diaspora, communities should unapologetically embrace and advocate knowledge and observance of mitzvot. If you want halakha to be healthy, responsive, and vibrant, it must be allowed a space to be articulated without irony and without apology. The notion that I can only protect individual autonomy by censoring the notion of normativity is toxic to reviving a normative language that can guide us through life's challenges. I desperately want to live in a world where I never hear someone express discomfort about the fact that someone has offered a normative opinion. That energy and discomfort, to the extent it exists, should be channeled into discussing the substance of the norms in question. Too many, too often, assume that normative statements are just cudgels wielded against deviant Jews, labeling them as bad, guilty, unfaithful. We must, as a community, grow up and recognize that norms are nothing more than articulated and projected expectations that in fact take people seriously and invite them to aspire to more thoughtful and directed forms of behavior. We have to move beyond an adolescent stance that sees every rule as an opportunity for rebellion and instead step into the Jewish normative discourse, into halakha as full citizens and participants in its conversation. Second, the revival of halakha depends on the revival of teaching it. It is uncomfortable to say it, but it is undeniably true. Outside many, though not all, but many Orthodox institutions, the North American Jewish community simply does not teach halakha, whether to its congregants, to its school children, to its educators, or sadly, even to its rabbis. The rule is simple. By their curriculum shall ye know them. Someone who simply does not know how to learn a Beit Yosef, a Shach, a Pitrei Tshuva, or a responsum of Rav Ovadia Yosef with confidence and fluency cannot claim to have anything to say about halakha and will never have any hope of saying something creative in its rich language. Would you ever imagine that an 8th grader in his 2nd year of French could compose a French poem? Have you ever imagined to yourself what contemporary American literature would look like if 90% of its authors were immigrants who had only started speaking and writing English 5 years prior? Why do you think halakha seems to many today to be in a crippled state, incapable of addressing the broad challenges of the day through a traditional normative lens? You really think it's unrelated to the fact that we have completely thrown in the towel on training people to be fluent in it? Who do you expect is going to produce the halakhic language that could speak to broad swaths of the Jewish community if those broad swaths of the Jewish community have institutions that don't train them to do so? The rejection of halakhic language is in fact often a concealment for an inability to speak it. If you long, as I do, for a world in which the best and brightest minds and souls will engage with our rich tradition and find those pearls of wisdom and insight that connect us to our past and offer direction in the present, then I beg of all of you in this room and all those over whom you have influence, stop tolerating mediocrity when it comes to the knowledge of and teaching of halakha. If a community is to be guided by halachic sources, then it must learn those sources regularly through a directive normative lens. If a school aims to make mitzvot a part of its students' lives, then it must teach the sources that explain how to play those mitzvot out in practice. And if rabbinical schools claim to train the next generation of Jewish leaders, their graduates must include true Talmidei Chachamim of the first order, who can swim in the language of psak and contribute their own voices to that conversation such that someone might read their writings hundreds of years from now. Finally, taking Jewish life seriously. And this is where everyone in this room and everyone who is a member of the Jewish community plays a critical role. We must vote with our feet and restore through our actions the omnipresence of mitzvot in the Jewish community. If we expect halakha to respond to our lives as lived, those lives need to be full of commitment and worthy of respect. We are all constantly called upon to answer the haunting charge of the prophet Malachi. Hakrivehu na lefechatecha, hayirtzecha o hayisaf anecha. Could you honestly say that you would put the quality and intensity of your Jewish life on a par with what would pass for excellence in the secular world? And if not, why on earth should generations past, as embodied in halachic sources, take you seriously enough to warrant admitting you into their conversation? Can you point to a strong community minyan 3 times a day? Could your community be a destination for someone seeking 50 families who are Shomrei Shabbat? Do those who lead services in your community know their craft and inspire confidence and religious aspiration? Or do they come off as novices that would never make it past the first round interview at any major law firm? Do people punctiliously tithe their incomes for tzedakah, understanding, as did all prior generations, that their income is not truly fully theirs? Or do they kvetch that they can't afford to donate even 1/20th of their income, even as they have smartphones and iPods and countless other gadgets that draw us away from true personal interaction? Is my community a sustainable model of religious commitment, whether by training true scholars or by baking matzah, such that I would be confident for the future of Judaism if it were dependent upon me and those in my community? In short, can you look yourself in the mirror and honestly say, when compared to committed Jews and Jewish communities of the past, yes, I measure up. I am a proud member of this storied community of history. Because only if we can answer those questions in the affirmative will we ever be able to have the self-respect to demand respect from those who preceded us. Chaim Soloveitchik, in his seminal essay, Religious Law and Change, reminds us why some communities merit having their religious instincts respected and why others do not. He writes, the Franco-German community in the Middle Ages was permeated by a profound sense of its own religiosity, of the rightness of its traditions, and could not imagine any sharp difference between its practices and the law which its members studied and observed with such devotion. The Provençal Jewish community and the Spanish ones, on the other hand, wrestling as they were with, or what they perceived to be, widespread religious laxity, had no such self-image, and it never occurred to the scholars of these communities, many of whom were in every sense the intellectual heirs of the French Tosophists, to seek to align their people's practices with the written word. Or more accurately, they never imagined that contemporary conduct was informative of Talmudic law, that the deeds of the common folk were revelatory of the divine intent. We must inspire to a level of integrity that we would expect others to be able to see. We can only fairly demand things of the conversation of the ages if we take full ownership of our place within it. Afilu rekanim shabach mle'in mitzvot karimon. I leave you with the goal tonight of working hard towards a vision of community where even the seemingly empty places are full of meaning, full of purpose, full of integrity, and full of commitment. So I am more happy to take questions, have a little conversation in the next 20 minutes or so of our time. Yes?
How true is it that this whole dynamic of secessionist halakha is limited to the Ashkenazi communities?
Okay. We'll get a few out here and then we'll answer them in turn. Great. Yes?
Earlier in the lecture you said that we need to expand our view of halakha to include everybody's viewpoints and everybody's perspectives on practice. Then near the end you said that because most people aren't educated, how could we expect them to really have like substantial input into halakha without that education? How do you reconcile those two things?
Great. Yes?
So I'm wondering along the same lines of, you said that halakha should be something that creates an inclusion of the majority of the community. At what point then, what becomes of halakha? When does halakha, at what point is it a path that guides us or a path that's created as we walk behind us?
Great. Okay, I'll start with those and then I'll take another round. So beginning with the historical question of Ashkenaz and Sfarad, look, the non-Ashkenazi communities don't go through the same process of emancipation, right? They don't ever have that kind of stripping of the Jewish community in the same way. And that's in fact why people like Tzvi Zohar, when they try to revive what he doesn't talk about it as secessionist halakha, but is bothered by the similar kind of trends, reaches for unexplored Sfaradi poskim, right? He reaches for those communities that in the 19th and 20th centuries are still engaging with things in that sort of a way, right? I mean, and there's all sorts of examples of that. It is no accident that it is a posek in India, and it would never really have possibly been a posek in Europe, that says, yeah, it's basically fine to ride a bike on Shabbat, okay? Why? Because he's addressing a very sort of local question of working through the issues, does this or does this not affect Shabbat, etc. Whereas in the European and American world, that question quickly gets wrapped up in, well, what is that going to say about what kind of Jew I am? Is that going to indicate I am in or out of some kind of camp? So I would agree with you. That is definitely a divide. And those sources become important resources for rebuilding a different kind of model. That said, part of the reason I referred to Rav Yitzchak Dov Bamberger is there always have been people, even in the post-emancipation West, who tried to maintain this model. It's just they don't dominate the discourse as we know it today. Now, the question of expanding halakha and needing education, needing commitment, how do you do it? I don't know. You have to do things like, start yeshivas. You have to do things like create institutions that actually put that reality on the ground. I think that the only answer is yes, there is a tremendous amount of work ahead of us. The good news, as I see it, is there's plenty of resources out there to do it. It's about selling the vision of the importance of it happening. Until people perceive, and that's part of what I'm trying to argue tonight, is people have to understand the consequences of not educating and empowering people in and what it will inevitably do to our larger discourse of halacha, Jewish norms, etc. In a way, there's a kind of chicken and egg. I mean, in the sense, the 3 steps I advocated for the poskim and the 3 steps for the community, you could easily get into a, kind of Mideast negotiations dynamic, right, where no one wants to take the first step, and therefore there's no possibility of meeting in the middle. But it does require some kind of meeting in the middle. But that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. It's a great question about kind of what makes. How do you distinguish between? I mean, I could put your question in an even starker form, which is, at what point does the fanciful language of having halacha interact with the reality of my life just become giving some traditional rubber stamp to that which I already do, right? And that is for sure of real concern if one is not careful about the conversation and how it proceeds. I would say a couple things. First of all, we're going to address some of this in the third part of this series. We're going to try to look at the dynamics of what it means to tackle some difficult issues through category shifts and other strategies. And hopefully that'll play out some of what it looks like in practice. But I would say it's ultimately about a certain degree of honesty and trust. You have to trust the tradition and the texts enough. This is what sort of mitzvah practice goes to. That, when you hear something that you don't really have a good rebuttal to, it seems like it's actually calling on you to do something, you indicate openness to step up and to change and to grow. And that, without that openness, it does become the kind of farce that you're talking about. I think, and that also goes to sort of amount of time spent in the conversation, right? Someone who shows up and in their first moment in the conversation reads a text and says, this text, either fits who I am or forget it, I throw it out. That doesn't lead to the possibility for conversation with the text any more than there would be a possibility of a conversation with a human being with that kind of dynamic. But I agree with your sensibility that's one of the main things to be on guard about. I think, what I've come to feel very strongly is that the risks, there's not a safe path of just sort of submitting, as it were, and that we'll talk about a little bit in next week's lecture. That has its own major consequences too. But there's risks all around. Yes, take another couple of questions.
Are you advocating creating a halacha that distinguishes between the lechatchila practice and allowing for a general b'diavad practice in order to accommodate those people, the way that rabbis in the Gemara had people who were tithing and people who were suspected of not tithing, and they were all part of the discourse? Would you like to recreate that scenario?
Okay. Repeat questions online. Okay, yes. So I'll say them out, the whole batch of them. Yeah, let's take these 3 over here. Yeah, Dave.
I have a good friend who considers himself a committed Jew and describes himself as such, though he only attends a few times attends synagogue a few times a year, and eats pork with a passion, and is amazed that I would ever carry around tefillin in my backpack, or even probably even own tefillin, and would reject the word halakha as having anything to do with his Jewish life or practice. How do I engage with him in this conversation?
Okay, yes.
So I want to know if you can talk a little bit more about normativity and specifically not apologizing for normativity.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's going to be normativity expected, is there a way to push back on the norms? And if so, is there an appropriate forum for doing so? Can rank and file and lay people do so? And if no, is it problematic, or do you see it as problematic for norms to go unchallenged?
Great. Nachum, yeah.
You've created a theory of succession, and then use certain responsive topologies, an example of the Magen Avraham and an example of Rav Moshe, to reinforce your theory. And yet, are those the best examples, one way or the other, of what you're trying to espouse? Because if you read, as you have, the introduction of the Igros Moshe, in which he basically says that he takes it upon himself to change things that people in generations before advocated. He himself might have looked at some of those people as successionists, and he himself
Great. Okay, so I'll take the last one first. This is always the case with kind of citing a tshuva. I agree with you. I struggled in choosing this example. Repeat the question. So the last question was, aren't there maybe some better examples of people to beat up on as secessionists, as opposed to, Rav Moshe Feinstein, whose example we looked at with the example of the actor, is potentially an example of someone who's trying to take a broader view that reevaluates questions in light of the contemporary reality. So my analysis of that tshuva is not intended as some analysis of or referendum on Rav Moshe as a total personality or a total posek. What struck me about that thing is very rarely do you get a tshuva where the person essentially says, I can't believe I'm talking to this person, which is what I understand that first paragraph to be. Right? This guy's view is like completely off in terms of what he thinks it plausible you could be as a Shomer Shabbat Jew, etc. And yet I'm talking with him. And so I would say, what I would say to you, but again, without claiming to really necessarily have the full picture on that, is that even if Rav Moshe's larger dynamics are as you say they are, this is a window into a dynamic where even he is subject to that. Now, by the way, this is the fair thing to say. We all have moments like that, right? I mean, I think, I have certainly gotten questions where I have that reaction of, I can't believe this person is asking me that question, right? I mean, I once got a question of, can I go with my family to shoot guns on Shabbat because it's like a long-standing family tradition that we have, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any way that you could somehow figure out that that's okay for Shabbat, et cetera, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, why are you shooting guns? Why is that a long-standing family tradition, et cetera, et cetera, okay? And there is a moment at which a person has to be able to say, be willing to say, I'm not sure I can go to where your question takes me. And that's where sort of numbers and proportions, I think, matter, right? It's not that there should never be anyone who, because of their choices, is shut out of the conversation. But if you get to a point where the vast majority of even Jews who would describe themselves as Jews who are committed, it's important to them to be Jewish, have that kind of dynamic with a posek, then something is off. And that's part of what I was trying to get at with that. Okay, I guess working backwards. Not apologizing for normativity, what does that mean? How does one, is there then room, once we allow for normativity, is there room to push back? Is there a mechanism for challenging it? Is it healthy, in fact, that it should be challenged? So this, in some ways, like the previous question, it goes very much to dynamics of trust. I mean, I think that's my expectation is that, my understanding of the deal is I have the right and the responsibility to get up in front of a room and say, here's what the tradition seems to say about what is demanded of us. And then and part of my job in doing that is to say that, but with kind of respect and openness and invitation to those in the room who are listening to that, to say something on the order of, but I really need to go and eat in my friend's house, even though they don't keep kosher. The black letter law that you just told me seems like it will make that impossible. I have to project enough openness that that person feels willing to ask that question. Without that person feeling that they can ask that question, then the system just becomes sick again, right? Just as sick as if one is not articulating the expectation in the first place. Now then what happens in the back and forth, I think very much depends on what that individual conversation looks like, right? In some situations, it turns out, oh, actually, now that you're raising it, this is more complex than I thought. There are such and such sources that open up the question of kashrut in a person's house where you're friends, but you're not comfortable. You're not comfortable with their approach to kashrut. And yeah, in fact, here's the language for how you would think that through. And sometimes a conversation goes to a place where the person actually needs you to buck them up to be able to say, yeah, this is actually a moment where your integrity and your commitment demands you being ambassador for the value at hand. But that should come out not because they're smacked down as, don't be a wayward person and do this, but because they own that. I don't know, there's probably a more elegant way to talk that through, but there is a messiness to it, like all real human relationships are messy, where there's got to be a genuine back and forth. Now, in a way, that's the best I can do on an answer for your friend with the pork and no tefillin and, bucking at the word halacha, etc. I'm sure you're not talking about yourself and just saying it's a friend, right? I'm just kidding. So, in any event, look, sometimes in a relationship like that, quite frankly, a person is so full of anger about any number of things, of which the receptacle is pork, no tefillin, etc., that you may not be able to say that much. All you may be able to do is love the other things about that person. I say this to my kids all the time, right? I don't apologize for the fact that there are Jews out there in the world who don't observe mitzvot in the way we do in our family, and that my opinion is that it's better to observe these mitzvot than not observe them. But I also tell them unambiguously, but you should know, a lot of those same people are, right, I try to be like Reish Lakish, a lot of those same people, I assume, are observing all kinds of other mitzvot much better than we are, right? You're not so great at respecting your parents all the time. You're not, right? You have any number of things that this person who, yeah, they're doing such and such on Shabbat, but what do you have any idea about that other aspect of their mitzvah personality? And so sometimes you can't actually engage them on a direct thing, but you can engage the person and bring them into a normative conversation from other angles that they're less hostile. But to someone who doesn't carry huge amounts of hostility, and it's just, that's what they do, it's just natural to them, well, then I think it's important to kind of own the power of refraining from pig, right? To be able to say to someone, here's why this is important, whether on the specifics of that or as part of a broader matrix of what it means to live a life of Torah and obligation, and this being one of those things, and to share that with them. And if the person is not overly hostile, they may hear it. They also may not. But at that point, that's where the autonomy kicks in, right? I mean, I think we have to sort of take the freedom and the autonomy of the contemporary world as a sort of a license not to have to convince everyone all the time. But that doesn't mean I have to therefore back, but it gives me the freedom. I'm not coercing someone by definition, even though I'm articulating my commitments and my expectations. As far as the chaschila b'diavad, I mean, look, the short answer to your question is, what counts as lechatchila, what counts as b'diavad, what are the kinds of post facto situations that we can tolerate? That's the meat of the halachic conversation, as it were. But that general dynamic, absolutely. I think that's just been lost, right? That has just, in most practicing communities today, been lost. And we're talking about like basic things. We're not talking about finding some obscure Provençal Rishon that was published for the first time by Hebrew U in 1970, right? We're talking about the Shulchan Aruch. We're talking about the Mishnah. We're talking about like basic dynamics of, stuff like, okay, you should have cooked this food in this kind of pot, but you cooked it in that kind of pot, so it's okay. Don't do it next time. This time it's okay. This was a situation out of your control. Fine, you can eat the food. If you catered it at home, don't do it that way. That is the black letter law. But to revive that kind of notion more broadly, I think is critical. I think we have time for one more. What time are we at here?
10 on.
Great, so we have 10 more minutes for any other thoughts and questions. Or you can call it a night. Yeah.
Another one. How about expanding the notion of normativity beyond the Jewish community? Since the rabbinic language does include the notion of Noahide law that applies to all human beings, would you be in favor of engaging all our fellow beings in a sense of normative language of divine expectation?
Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
I think that there are some assumptions that you're making of the descendants of the Hirsch way of thinking that they would probably take you to issue. For instance, the way they formulate how halacha may have changed or is changing. They're not troubled by some of the issues that you are, so the questions that apply to you might not apply to people within their community. And that might speak more to your point, but it also sort of doesn't speak to them. And they do reach out in forms of kiruv to people
people. So I think that there are a couple issues that I'm sure to a certain extent you would also agree with, but it's a more balanced and nuanced argument that you make.
Right. So like any presentation like this, there's always some, archetyping that goes on in order to highlight certain things, and I think you're certainly right that there are any number of dynamics like that that are worthy of more kind of complex unpacking. But I will say that even in the way you formulated it are some of the seeds of some of what I'm talking about. That is to say, this is not of concern to my community. Well, what community is that? If it's of concern to many, many Jews, then at a certain point you're back at the statement of the many, many Jews are not really my community, or I don't really own their problems, or I'm not responsible for their problems. Now again, as I said, we all have that limit. And everyone's got some frontier of the Jewish community that is sort of the Wild West to them, and they're not going to go out there and get too involved in taming it. The question is, what is a responsible percentage of the Jewish community to have living out in the Wild West without any government whatsoever? And that's where I take issue with some of those dynamics that I think are in place. Look, Kiruv, I think, is an interesting example of, let's take Chabad as an example, okay? I think Chabad is a great example of, and this is why, I laid out kind of these different criteria that I think are all important of how the halachic dynamic sort of has to change. Chabad does not have a secessionist halacha in the sense of, I don't care about all those people out there, right? Lahefech. They are the paradigms of caring about every single Jew, caring that every Jew have observance, etc., etc. But they are secessionist halachas in the sense that the way you do it is this way, right? There is sort of a Chabad package to the point where other religious Jews, right? Those of us who grew up as like religious, we thought knowledgeable, practicing Jews, you can go into a Chabad space and they're like, no, you have to do it this way. And you're like, what are you talking about? Like, I've never seen it done that way. Well, you have to say this Kaddish here at this time. You have to do the lulav with this kind of binding, et cetera, et cetera. So they've chosen, right? And there's different kinds of kiruv in that way, right? I think there's a kiruv that basically says, I am open to bringing you in to this very specific rule book specified way of doing it, and I hope you'll be a part of that. But that kind of kiruv is sometimes implausible as a way of life that everyone could adopt. And in fact, that's actually how Chabad really operates, right? Chabad doesn't actually try to turn everyone into Chabad Hasidim. They try to get Jews to do individual mitzvot in a sort of scattershot way. They're not on a missionizing program to make everyone look like them, be like them, dress like them, in part because I think they are self-conscious of the fact that that would be implausible, right? That would require withdrawal from certain basic things that people take for granted. So it's complicated, and you're right to point out that some of the bright white lines probably have a little more of shades of gray in them. But I do still think you do come back over and over again to, what can I responsibly look in the mirror and say, I'm actually asking of the entire Jewish community, and what kind of claim do I imagine it to make on me? How do I have to, right? I'm not sure that your average Chabadnik, when they confront a congregant who comes to them with a real challenge of this halacha is not making sense as applied to me, sees his obligation to have anything to do with re-examining that halacha and its application as much as it is, how can I come up with a better explanation for this halacha to convince this person? And those are two very different things. I'll come back to your question, but I want to get the last round here. Yeah, Chippy and then Dad, and then we'll close it up with that.
If only a very unique subset of the Jewish community is to sort of internalize this vision of halakha and sort of like integrate that theory of halakha into their practice such that it might change from how it looks today, that's probably going to create even more sectarianism, which is one of the goals that we're trying to prevent. So how much should that be a concern?
Okay. Just flesh out your question there a little more. Make sure I understand.
So if you're trying to bring halacha to be a little more realistic and deal with issues that may be pushing people away from halachic lifestyle, um, how is that going to be not just going away from like the ideal kind of halachic framework, and actually be how are you going to bring those people into the discourse is what I'm wondering.
As opposed to just bending the discourse to them.
Right. And how are they going to how are they going to want to come into this community and accept halacha and want to be in that?
Okay, so I'll do it again here in reverse order. The second part of what I talked about was essentially intended to address that point, which is to say that, yeah, a part of this rejiggering, a part of this dance, has to include, if it's to be kind of a real reevaluation, talking about mitzvot unapologetically, inviting, expecting, getting people to aspire to being a part of that, and projecting that as this is a great thing you should want to be a part of. A piece of making it possible for people to be a part of it is making it something they could plausibly want to be a part of, and being willing to articulate in very direct ways, how halacha might speak differently to certain issues than is commonly assumed. But an equally critical part of it, just as critical a success of retooling that relationship is proudly and unambivalently talking about mitzvot as a rich and important way of living out what it authentically means to be a Jew. The only way that, getting into that, just talking about this is a great thing, this is very important. One of the ways why do I think that's not a lost cause? Because I do believe that the contemporary world is, for many people, in many places, devoid of meaning and purpose. There is a feeling that many people have, whatever their background and inclination to religious observances, of not having as clear a sense as they would like of how should I behave, how should I act, how should my life be structured, why am I here to do what, etc., etc. You only have to see Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life and a number of copies that sold to understand the ways in which people in the general culture are looking for that sense of purpose. In that sense, I think mitzvot is not that bad a product to sell right now as a concept, as a notion. Where it can get hung up is, well, are these mitzvot speaking to me, or are they asking me to somehow become some 13th century person that I'm not? Right? That's where it can go deeply off the rails. Again, I come back to a theme I've been emphasizing over and over again tonight, which is trust. I think, one of the biggest enemies, I didn't talk about this, but one of the biggest enemies of this larger project is the abuse of power and authority by those who are part of halachic discourse. Most who are part of that discourse are not a part of that, but all it takes is a few people for people then to have an allergy to the language of authority at all. Okay, I think you can't be totally shut down by that dynamic. So we can talk more about this after, but in short I would say your feeling of, but don't people have to be invited to come in? Absolutely. That's also very much a part of the dynamic, but you also have to be not overly scary and offensive such that conversation can get off the ground. Now, as far as Chippy, your question of doesn't this just create new sectarians? Look, you began with the premise that this is a unique subset of the Jewish community that would sign on to this vision. Obviously, my hope would be that that's not the case. That is to say that this kind of way of talking about halacha would eventually conquer the discourse. The way we would think about it would be the way that poskim would talk and engage, etc., etc. If you ask me in the short term, right, if I live in a short-term world where I want to be a part of the conversation of observance and commitment, and overwhelmingly the conversation of observance and commitment orbits around the kind of halachic conversation that is being argued against in a lot of what I talked about tonight. So aren't I just in the short term cutting myself off from the vast majority of people who observe Torah and mitzvot? So that's why I made the case in the first part of my talk tonight, that I am concerned that that picture of commitment to Torah and mitzvot around what I was calling a secessionist halacha is far less stable than it appears to be. And I worry for its future. And in the name of worrying for that future, I would rather bet on this horse. But it's a bet. And you sometimes lose bets. So there's no way to totally guarantee what that outcome is. But I would say it's critical at every step along the way to not adopt that pose. And part of that means not only having elite institutions, elite people who buy into this, but creating, a network, a reality on the ground that really supports that. I think I will hold your question at bay and end there. I want to emphasize that this is really, in my mind, kind of the beginning of a draft of thinking about these issues publicly, and just to thank all of you individually very deeply for being my chavruta in this conversation beginning this week, and I'm looking forward to doing it again next week and the week after. And I hope that in microcosm, this can be the beginning of the kind of conversation I was talking about tonight, where there's a lot of trust, there's a lot of buy-in, there's a lot of commitment, and we can say some interesting things. So thank you.